Yellow light pooled like honey over the diner's counter, soft against the rain as it ran down the glass. Inside, the night smelled of coffee and fried onions. The grill sang a steady, comforting hiss. One place at the counter was always set for two, a second fork and knife laid beside a plate that had been washed and kept ready, as if at any moment someone might walk in and sit down. A small framed photograph leaned against the napkin dispenser, two faces, smiling in a sunlit yard. The man who came every night slid into the booth opposite the empty plate without saying a word. He folded the napkin over his lap, unfolded the photo, and traced a line on the glass without taking his eyes off the picture. He had done this for 1,200 nights. The diner's name, Maggie's, was lettered on the glass in chipped paint. Inside, the regulars knew the rituals. An order of the chili, a slice of apple pie if it was Tuesday, the same man who always left $1 in the tip jar for someone who couldn't afford a cup. He was known as Jack Rowan to the waitress, and as that quiet one to the busboy. To the photograph, he was simply the other half of a life that still lived inside him in the margins. Sarah, laughing with a flower-streaked cheek, arms around him like a promise. It was late. The town's neon blinked out beyond the diner like a scattering of fireflies. Rain softened every sound. The bell above the door chimed, and a man and a child stepped in. Wet hair, a small backpack, the kind of boots that had seen many winters. The man's coat sagged with fatigue and a dozen pockets of worry. The child clung to his hand, eyes wide and unaccustomed to restaurant light. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Can my son sleep in here tonight?" the man asked. And the words arrived like a question no one expected, but everyone understood. His voice was careful, shaped to keep the shame small. It landed not as a demand, but as a plea for mercy in the face of the night. There was a pause. The waitress glanced across the counter. A few heads turned. Jack felt the photograph in his hands as if it were a little heartbeat against his palm. He looked up slowly at the father and the boy. The child had a rain-dark face and eyelashes stitched with water. He smiled at the counter's pie display, small and hopeful, as if the world might be summed up in a slice of warmed crust. Outside, through the rain-streaked window, a black luxury sedan idled for a moment at the curb. The man inside did not come in at first. He watched instead. He had come early to see the town. He always liked to see how ordinary lives met day and night. But tonight, his gaze lingered on the diner as if it were a stage, and he, by accident, had caught the rehearsal. He saw the wet shoes, the child's clutching smallness, and the upturned question that held a whole life's urgency. Jack pushed the photo into the little frame's edge until it snapped, and he smiled at the boy. "Sit," he said.
"You can sit here." The second set of silverware clicked against the white plate as the waitress, Maggie's niece Lucy, poured 2 bowls of the chowder she made like her aunt used to, with a pinch of thyme and a careful hand. Jack ordered an extra piece of apple pie without thinking, because some habits are prayers. The father sat as if movement itself might betray him. He set the child on the seat beside him, and in a voice that admitted no excuses, all the reasons for that night's question unspooled. The lost job, the landlord's note, the last place being full and unsafe. He said the words plainly. He kept the shame soft with small details, work cards folded in a wallet, a name tag from a place that still owed him wages. So the people at the counter would know he was a man who had worked, who had not made a home of idleness. Jack poured the soup between 2 bowls, pushed one toward the father and the child, then handed them the slice of pie as if bread and kindness were the same. The father's hands trembled a little as he took it. The boy, Eli, took a bite, and his face changed. He looked like a child who had been given a storybook to read, astonished, delighted, as if someone had found him in the dark and turned the page to a better scene. The man who'd been watching from the car now stepped inside. He moved quietly, not the sort who liked attention. He had a way about him that said oceans had been crossed not by accident, but by intent, and tonight his intent was simple and human curiosity. He took a booth a few stools away and ordered black coffee. He watched with a look that held some private chart of the world, measurements, potential, probability, yet his eyes softened when the boy laughed and the father's shoulders let down a fraction. The first block of the story ended there, at a counter with 2 bowls of soup, a piece of pie, and a man who had asked a question that demanded more than a plate could give. Jack folded his napkin and said what the room had been trying to say quietly for him. "You can stay a little while. We'll figure the next step in the morning." The father's voice cracked into something like gratefulness. He repeated the request in a different key. "My boy can't sleep in the car tonight. Can he have the corner booth?" And Jack moved his hand in a way that offered the entire booth like a small, fragile roof. If you believe no one should ever have to eat alone, stay with this story. They closed up the diner at midnight, but not before the owner, an elderly man named Sam Jackson, who knew grief and kindness in equal measures, offered a broom for the boy to sweep crumbs into, turning a corner of the place into a temporary bedroom with a blanket and a pillow Sam produced from a closet. The father sat on the stool and watched his son sleep, and in the margin of Jack's heart a small thing unfurled, recognition of a grief that could be answered with presence rather than pity.
By morning, the rain had stopped. The town had a new brightness to it. The millionaire, Mr. Robert St. Clair, as his name would be learned, had left a neatly folded bill on the table with a note that said nothing but a single line: "Keep his eyes bright." Jack found the envelope as he cleared a counter, and for a moment he felt like the steward of a bank he'd never had. He tucked the money into his wallet like a talisman and felt the odd mix of unease and responsibility that money sometimes brings to people who have learned to live without it. The father, his name was Daniel, refused most offers at first. Proud men often do. They eat the kindness and try, dishonorably, to return it with debt. Daniel refused offers to stay in shelters because shelters had rules that felt like cages. He refused to take a handout because he had dignity in his bones. But dignity is not the same as stubbornness, and the town had ways of meeting firm refusals with practical persistence. Jack knew several people who could use a good pair of hands. Marcus, who ran the bakery 3 blocks down, kept early hours and was always looking for someone who could stand the heat of the oven and the discipline of a 6:30 morning. Jack remembered Marcus because years ago Sarah had left bread cooling on his windowsill, and the two of them had shared stories over coffee. Jack called Marcus and explained the situation without embellishment: a man with work in his hands and a child who needed a floor tonight. Marcus listened, and when he heard that the child could help sweep and the father would be there before dawn, he did not hesitate. "Have him come by at 5. Bring him a hat," Marcus said. The bakery ran on hands and humility. It was the kind of place where people were remade into community because the work itself demanded you stand with others. Daniel showed up at 5, sleep-lined but clean, and Marcus put him through the baptism of early rising tasks: stoking the ovens, kneading, shaping dough with an exact, uncomplaining muscle that teaches patience. The dough did not discriminate between the rich and the poor. It asked only for attention. Working with his hands, Daniel discovered that the world could be altered by the right pressure of palm and thumb. The dough answered him like a shy animal learning to trust. Eli sat on a low stool in a corner, sorting order slips and handing small tools to the bakers, as if the place were a classroom and he the keenest student. Jack visited the bakery at noon and watched as Daniel, flour-smudged and proud, handed over a tray of rolls to a smiling customer. Something true and old stitched itself that afternoon, the sight of someone who had been wandering, finding a rhythm that mattered. Leela, Jack's daughter, was there too. She had the small, unself-conscious courage of children who make friends without a checklist.
She sat with Eli by the back window on a crate turned into a bench and swapped stories about pirate adventures and the best kind of pie. The photograph in Jack's pocket felt lighter. Word spreads in small towns like dry leaves in wind. Gossip, worry, and wonder all move at the same velocity. By the second week, there were whispers in the grocery line. Why was Jack letting a stranger eat at his table? Some wondered if Daniel would overstay what charity could reasonably hold. A few raised eyebrows at the sight of a regular man lending his name to someone whose shoes were scuffed. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down from Jack and who kept an eye on the street like a lighthouse, wrote a note asking for clarification. "We don't want trouble," she said, in careful handwriting that hid a softer question. Jack answered with small substantiations rather than speeches. He invited neighbors to the bakery to see how Daniel worked. On a slow Tuesday, he arranged for Marcus to show the town how much care went into preparing a loaf, how the bakers woke before dawn and the trays that went into ovens needed strong backs and honest hands. Seeing Daniel in motion, kneading, watching the dough rise, greeting customers with a polite, practiced "good morning," the town's anxiety softened into curiosity. People began to buy his rolls not because they were told to, but because the bread tasted like it had been made by someone who had something to prove to himself. Meanwhile, Mr. St. Clair, the man in the expensive coat who had watched the first night, returned to the scene not as a savior but as a witness who had the means to amplify what was already happening. He observed it first from a corner booth, then from the bakery window, and what he saw quietly altered the ledger of his life. He had built businesses, employed hundreds, and yet nothing in his balance sheet read the word home. He had been taught to put value in returns and compound interest,
But there are profits of a different kind. A child's laugh, a man's steadiness, a woman's pie cooling on a sill in memory. Robert spoke to Jack one afternoon as the oven hummed. "You were with them the night it rained?" He asked, not demanding credit, but wanting to know the origin story of what he'd watched. He answered without drama. He asked if his son could sleep here tonight. I didn't see how to say no. Robert didn't offer a check then. He listened, and then he listened some more. That is often what people with means forget. Listening is a kind of capital. In the following weeks, he began to ask questions of his own about small things. Did the bakery need a warmer oven? Would a second mixer speed the production so Daniel could take on extra shifts and save? Could a small grant help them file the paperwork they needed to sell under the town's regulations? When Robert did step in, he did it the way a careful hand lays a plank in a bridge, not as a replacement for the bridge, but as reinforcement.
He wrote a check to Marcus for a second oven and offered a microloan to start a small program, a Saturday morning class where the bakery trained people in basic pastry skills and then helped them sell what they made. It was not a flashy gift. It had conditions and expectations and a timeline. Jack insisted the loan be structured so it would be repaid to a fund that would support another person in need down the line. The millionaire agreed. "Make it pay forward," Robert said. "Don't make it a rescue. Make it a start." He meant rescue in the old, lonely way that erases agency. What he offered instead was a tool. With the oven and the new mixer, the bakery's output doubled, and the town's hope grew in proportion. Daniel learned a recipe for honesty and quality, as much as for bread. He began to bake a small, crusty loaf that the neighbors came to prefer when they wanted something plain and honest for supper. Eli started school on a link arranged by Marcus's wife, who did paperwork on the afternoons she wasn't baking cinnamon rolls. Lila and Eli swapped homework and secrets and built pillow forts under the long, clocked counters on afternoons when the bakery was quiet. The apple pie came back one Sunday, when Jack, feeling a nostalgia like a physical ache, brought in a pie he'd baked from a recipe Sarah had taught him once, her hands guiding his as if she were still there. The first bite was a quiet lightning strike for everyone who tasted it. The crust flaked in a memory of laughing afternoons. The cinnamon cupped the edges like an old familiar song. Daniel closed his eyes at the first mouthful, and Jack saw, in that brief absence of speech, the way a heart recognizes what it needs, even before it knows how to ask for it. But not everything unfolds gently. The town, which had watched the rescue with a grateful curiosity, found space for one more murmur: suspicion. A local shop owner whose rent had recently increased, because property values creep like vines once attention arrives, began to grumble. "Why is the bakery getting investment?" she asked, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Why is my corner seeing dollars and our rents rising?" It was a hard question, one that held the complexity of gentrification and of community resources. Jack wished for an easy answer, but found none. He met gossip with honesty. The money was a loan meant to be paid forward, and the bakery existed to feed people and give apprenticeships, not to displace them. The conflict came to a head the week of Thanksgiving, when a permit issue threatened to close down the small Saturday market where Daniel sold loaves and the apprentices sold pastries. An inspector arrived with a yellow notice in his hand, and the whiteness of papers against the bakery wall looked like a verdict. Marcus sat with his elbows on the table, white flour on his hands. The apprentices, young and hopeful, looked to Jack with open questions written on their faces. It would have been easy for Robert to be the man to sign a check and make the caper problem disappear. He could have glided in with a smile and a press release and erased every difficulty. But the script would have also erased the people who had built the tiny infrastructure of help. Instead, Robert made calls, quiet ones, and used his connections to fast-track the permit process. But he did not erase the necessity of Marcus learning the ropes of compliance. He did not take away the responsibility of the apprentices to understand how to run a business beyond the joy of baking. He put his weight behind the community's effort and taught them how to lean into bureaucracy instead of being defeated by it. "You've got to keep the work honest," Robert said to Marcus, who had been tempted to use the grant to scale faster than the town could hold. "Make sure the people who work here know why they matter. That way, when paperwork comes, you can show them the proof." It was not a flourish, it was counsel aimed at making the change sustainable. Those weeks were a lesson in patience. Daniel learned that receiving help did not strip him of his dignity if he met it with responsibility. He started saving a little from each shift, first just quarters, then dollars, until the numbers in his notebook began to be less humiliating and more like a plan. He and Jack agreed on small contracts. Daniel would work at the bakery and also help Jack repair engines at the local garage part-time. The arrangement built self-respect into the rhythm of his days. He had to wake up early, learn the language of yeast and toil, read invoices, and, most importantly, stand before customers and answer the simplest question with a smile. People who had once whispered under their breath now came to buy bread and to ask Daniel for tips on roasting vegetables or how to keep dough from sticking. Mrs. Patterson bought one of his loaves every other Saturday, and with it a small card of encouragement. The small card said, hand-winning, keep going, and Daniel pinned it to the inside of his apron like a medal. Time passed with the slow certainty of seasons. The bakery became a small hub, a child trading stories for a cookie, an older neighbor leaving jams for sale on a consignment shelf, a teacher offering to help Eli with reading. The place turned into something between a church and a workshop. People came to be fed, to be worked, and to be useful. Jack watched it all and found his own life bridling toward repair the way a plant curves toward sunlight. The crisis that tested them did not take the form of a dramatic fall, but a quieter, more honest strain. A winter storm knocked out the bakery's heat for 3 nights, and one of the ovens cracked, leaving Marcus with a repair bill larger than his monthly margin. Sales dipped because people feared the cold. It was then that Robert made a choice not to swoop in and make problems disappear, but to stand in solidarity.
He offered to loan the bakery money at little to no interest for a brief period, but he also encouraged Marcus to form a small cooperative of bakers and customers to invest in the repair, turning the problem into a shared project. Some balked at first, not wanting to participate in what felt like charity. Others, moved by the bakery's consistent help, gave what they could. The repair was paid, the oven hummed back to life, and the feeling of communal ownership deepened. On Christmas Eve, the bakery hosted its first communal dinner, a free meal for anyone who needed it. The word spread quietly, no press release, no social media sizzle, just hand-to-hand invitations. The night came with its own hush, clean and expectant. String lights were threaded across the rafters, and the ovens painted the room in warm amber. Tables were set, and someone had brought holly. A long table stuffed with bread and pie and hot soup sat in the center. It was a simple feast, the kind that makes promises out of steam and breadcrumbs. Daniel stood before the gathered people, and when he spoke, his voice was only slightly shaky. "I asked," he said, and the phrase crashed like a tiny, honest tide into the room. He told the story of the diner, of the question he'd asked into the rain, of how a pulled-out chair had become the hinge on which everything turned. His words did not aim at boasting. They were a ledger of gratitude. He thanked Jack, who had helped without asking for thanks. He thanked Marcus for the oven that would soon be repaired. He thanked Eli for being brave enough to sleep under a diner's light and later to learn the names of loaves and customers. And when he looked across the room, his eyes found Robert St. Clair, who nodded and returned the gaze without a bow. The millionaire had never taken the stage. He had not sought a spotlight. His presence was an amplification, like the way a lighthouse adds its beam to a coastline already navigable by stars. There were speeches that night, short ones, and laughter and quiet weeping. A little boy who had once been standing under an umbrella now stood on a chair and declared, to the room's delight, that he would be a baker when he grew up. Leela, who'd watched the whole story with a child's unembarrassed hope, walked the long table distributing slices of pie. Jack sat at the head, not with a sense of ownership, but with the simple pride of someone who had seen a promise begin to keep itself. The dinner's litany of small miracles was not the kind that makes newspapers. No single person pulled a lever and changed everything. Instead, what altered the town was a chain: a chair pulled out, a bowl placed, a job given, an oven mended, a loan made with a stipulation to share. The millionaire had played a part. He had used his capital to fix practical problems, but the dignity of the transformation belonged to the people who showed up every day and made bread and payment and trust. Robert's role was catalytic. It did not erase the need for work or the pain of previous nights. He gave them something usable and walked away knowing the rest would be sustained by hands that had already proven they would. In the months that followed, small changes accumulated. Daniel moved from sleeping under the diner's eaves to a room above the bakery, hired through a plan that Marcus had organized, an affordable rent arrangement, and a clause that gave priority to people coming through the bakery's training program. Eli's backpack became less worn, his appetite steadier, his laugh more frequent. Jack found that evenings at the diner were no longer the sole place he paused to talk to a photograph. His own home had a kind of life in it now. Leela left a note on the mantel and a drawing so that sometimes, when he felt the old loneliness rise, Jack would look at the drawing and see a new family forming. There were awkward days. There were missteps. Daniel forgot an order and a customer made a sour comment. A check bounced and worried everyone for a morning. Yet those were absorbed by the community's resilience rather than used to justify exile. The townspeople learned that rebuilding dignity takes small, consistent acts rather than a single grand gesture. A year after that rainy night, the bakery held another communal meal. This time it was not only for those in need, but for everyone who had helped in the small rebuilding process. The woman who loaned chairs from her event barn, the teacher who tutored Eli, Robert who had taught them how to think about scalable help, Marcus who had kept his doors open, Mrs. Patterson who had quietly donated blankets, and Jack who had pulled a chair without knowing he was beginning a movement. The photograph that had lived in Jack's diner was framed in his kitchen now, among flour canisters and a rolling pin. On the back of the frame, Jack had written 3 words, "She was here." Some nights, when the house felt quiet and the smell of bread still lingered, he would set the table for one more, pull out the second fork, and not feel the hollow any longer. The empty place at the table had been filled by laughter and pie, and the inside-out warmth of people who chose to be kin. On that evening, with the bakery's window frosted at the edges, Jack sat at a table with Daniel and Eli and Leela. Outside, the street glowed with lights, and inside there were voices softened by gratitude. Someone at the end of the long table raised a glass. "To the chair that became a table," the woman said, and there was a round of good-humored applause. No one forgot that the first night had started with a question that could have been shoved aside and forgotten. No one forgot the man in the black sedan who'd watched and later decided to invest not in spectacle, but in scaffolding that held up what the town had already begun.
What had begun as an act of hospitality, the simplest act of asking someone to sit, had become something larger, a small movement that reminded people how to see one another. The town's story did not erase the reasons people ended up in doorways or under tarps. It only insisted they be met in their full humanity. If someone had asked then whether Daniel's son could sleep in the diner that night, the answer would have been an unhesitating yes. But the realness of that answer was no longer about a single night. It was about the nights that followed. A room above a bakery, a hand to hold, a job to do. A course of small, steady acts that made a life. The millionaire had seen everything, and had used his vision to amplify what was already being built. Not to lift a single person out in a way that erased their agency, but to give them tools and a platform to continue the work. At the close, Jack walked to the window and looked up. He thought of Sarah's hands shaping a pie crust, and felt as if in the warmth spilling from the bakery, there was a kind of answer that didn't rely on neat theology, but on human resolve, memory made into action. He touched the photograph on the mantel, and spoke to the empty air in the way people sometimes do when a quiet presence is needed. "She would have liked this," he said, and the house felt less like an archive of loss, and more like a place where stories were kept alive. The last image was ordinary and stubbornly beautiful. A long table under string lights, elbows touching, plates steaming, a child laughing and passing a roll across to a neighbor. A man who had once slept with the stars over him, now tucking his son into a small bed above the bakery. The empty chair still existed in some ways. It was a memory not to be dismissed. But its place at the table had become a pivot rather than a wound. The town had learned to notice, to move, and to trust that small acts compounded into a life that could be sustained. If this moved you, consider supporting a local shelter or community kitchen.